Mr. Castillo. Dr. Davis.
Here.
Ms. Holloway.
Here.
And Mr. Morris is not present.
Okay, so can I get a motion to go to the opening, our first item, which would be recognition of guests?
Yeah, you don't need to vote.
I don't have to have a motion.
For that, we'll just go straight to approval of the minutes.
All right, can I get a motion to approve? Ms. Holloway, do I have a second?
Where are the minutes?
Mr. Castillo?
They were in your board.
Where are the-
packet. Oh,
I'm sorry.
You do. I'll get them. Oh, shit. We have no minutes. They were all received. They were in our board packets.
We're hunting down a copy of the August 31st, 2023 minutes.
Packet. Yeah.
Okay.
We could come back to that item if
Okay,
you want.
all right. So do I need to make a motion to amend the agenda?
No, we'll just come back to it. Let's go straight to,
New business?
yes.
All right. Item 3.1, consideration of a review of the technical properties of Louisiana's current growth model. Get a motion to consider? Mr. Castillo?
Motion to receive.
Receive.
Second.
Second, Ms. Holloway? Okay.
Okay.
We're ready for you, Chris.
Okay, thank you so much. I assume everybody can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you all. And glad to reconvene this group. And let me just briefly share what we propose as our agenda for today. I think we have handled the welcome and introductions. I think the panel knows one another. I think I'll just note that our colleague Greg Cizik was unable to join. But we have Mike and Christy and Chris. We have our threshold of Chris's today. So Chris Tomaleski with the center as helping coordinate. My colleague Chris Brandt from the Center for Assessment is here. He's helping also to coordinate and to take notes. And then we have Christine or Chris Don Francesco, in addition to Christy Hovanitz and Mike Russell. So thank you everybody for being here. And what we will proceed to do is the first two items, colleagues, are really primarily by way of follow-up at the August 31st meeting. There were a number of really thoughtful questions that were raised, and thanks to the department, we have some information to share with you that will help both shine some light on questions pertaining to the technical properties of Louisiana's growth model and the way that it is integrated in the state accountability system, the state school accountability system. And then we'll shift to discussions related to technical properties of LEAP. Both of those are really in service to helping us shore up some of the technical questions the panel had. We'll take a brief break after that. And then the remainder of the afternoon, we hope to spend time helping to identify the scope and priorities for our next steps, which really gets to the heart of what this panel is here to do, which is to provide feedback to the board about promising practices with respect to growth broadly. And then, of course, we've encumbered time for public comment. I want to make sure I follow any and all board protocols. So I trust that folks there in Baton Rouge let me know if at any point we need to pause and take care of any formalities. Okay.
We're good.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we'll just dive right into the first item about reviewing technical properties for the growth model. As we discussed last time, Louisiana's growth model is a value-added model. It compares actual to predicted performance using state tests. It works on the concept of comparing peers with similar previous assessment scores and background characteristics. And here on this slide, you see the list of characteristics that are considered in the model. And I won't read that. And I believe this was also noted in the August meeting, but I wanted to make sure that the panel has this information available for your scrutiny. The process for determining influence of growth and accountability Thomas touched on this in August, and I'm going to try my best to review these key points just by way of having the panel really focus on the key questions that we're here to discuss. It's a multi-step process, and folks will recall that the first step asks if students are on track to mastery, and every student that scores below mastery is going to get a growth target for the following year that indicates the growth required to be on track to mastery by 8th or 10th grade. So for example, if the mastery target is 750, which I believe it is, and the student is in 7th grade, well, their target would be 750 because they only have 1 year to get to the target. If that student was in 6th grade, and they needed to cover 50 points in 2 years, then they'd have to progress. That growth target would be 25 points in each year. So it's simply looking at where the student is now, where they need to be at mastery. If the student has achieved or is on track to mastery, then they've satisfied step 1, the school receives 150 points for that performance. If not, then the model will assign points according to the growth percentile that the student's VAM score is in. Now recall the VAM is a residual score. Scores north of 0 are positive, they beat expectations. Scores that are less than 0 are negative, meaning the student did not perform as their academic peers typically do. Regardless of what the student's VAM score is, the process is to assign a percentile, is to assign points based on the percentile bands that you see in the slide here. And again, this is all in service to the values that schools receive by aggregating across students for incorporation into the school accountability model. And then just to unpack that a little bit more, if a student scores advanced in the prior year, if they maintain that advanced performance, then they're going to get 150 points. That's the maximum. Obviously, 150 is a very favorable score. If a student was advanced in the prior year, declines to mastery, then we look to those percentile bands on the previous slide to give information as to how those growth points are included in the model. So student scores mastery in the prior year, then they get a target associated with advanced performance. So there's an incentive for the student to continue to progress. If the student reaches the target to receive to earn advanced, then they get the maximum points, 150. If not, similar to the previous category, you'd look to those percentile bands noted in the previous slide to see the number of points that are assigned to that student for purposes of growth scores in the SPS. And let me pause there. I felt like providing a reminder of that context will help us interpret the information that will follow. So I really appreciated this information that the department provided us. And this is in service to the panel's really good questions about understanding the distribution of performance. So you see, here we see columns for each of years 2019, 2021, and 2022. Of course, in 2020, the model was suspended. And what you see here, each cell is the percent of students that earned a growth score in each of the identified categories. So in 2022, about a third of the students, 33%, would have received the 150 points because they met the growth target. And we just discussed the conditions that would lead to that. And then you can see in subsequent rows for each of the year columns, you can see the percent of students that received points in according to where they are in the percentile bands. So, and the 5% of students in 2022 didn't meet the growth target, but we're in that 80 to 99th percentile. So which stand to reason that'd be a fairly small number because most students who grew at very favorable rates with respect to percentiles also met their growth target. But here you see 5% of students. These would be students in this particular cell that would have been well below the target in a prior year, but grew at a very favorable rate, but still aren't at the target or at the on track threshold. And again, I won't talk about every cell, but I'll just pause here so people can appreciate the information that the department pulled for us here. looks like in terms of percentile bands, that 85-point band, which is the 40th to 59th percentile, is where we find the majority of the students that are scores that are earned through step 2. And if any point anybody has a question or a comment, please don't hesitate to chime in. But here's another look. Again, much appreciation to the department for pulling together this information that shows, I kind of think of it as something of a pipeline analysis. They show the outcomes in grade 8 based on student performance in grade 3. So if you want to look at the far left column, you see the state assessment performance categories in 3rd grade. And again, we're going to start in 2017, which would place most students in 8th grade at 2022. And in the first table, you see what this is an average of the VAM percentile. I'll say more about that in a second, for each of those corresponding category intersections. And then in the bottom panel, you see the number of students who are in that category. Let's just take a few to provide a little bit more context to make sure people understand that. So at the top left cell where it says 31 in the first panel says these are, if you look at the bottom panel, there are 1,703 students who were scored at unsatisfactory in 2017 in the 3rd grade, were also unsatisfactory as 8th graders. And their average VAM score, and again, this is a percentile, was a 31. If you go all the way to the right, students who progressed, that had fantastic progress from 3rd grade to 8th grade, where they started unsatisfactory and they moved to advanced, grew at an 88th percentile on average. And I understand that this is averaged across all years, so it's not just the 8th grade year, it's the average of their VAM scores for each of the intervening years from 3rd to 8th.
And Chris, out the very small population that represents of 12 kids.
Exactly. Thank you for noting that. We did suppress if it was less than 10, but you're right, that particular cell is just barely above 10.
So can I ask,
So Chris, oh, sorry, go.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding it. So the far left column, the unsatisfactory, those are kids that scored in the 31st percentile in their 3rd grade score. And then, that's the number of kids, I'm sorry, who were in the 31st percentile in the 3rd grade and also in the 31st percentile in the 8th grade. And that's 1,703 students basically stayed where they were in an unsatisfactory leap score from 3rd grade all the way to 8th.
You're very close.
Okay.
It's students who scored unsatisfactory in 3rd grade, scored unsatisfactory in 8th grade. There
Okay.
were 1,700 of those students.
Okay.
Their average percentile was 31%.
Okay.
So when you go to the right, you see that students who went from the lowest category to the next category, they were in the 58th percentile on average. If
Okay.
they made it to basic, they averaged the 70th percentile. If they made it to mastery, they were in the 76th percentile. If they made it to advanced, they were in the 88th percentile. Does that
Okay.
make more sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I like to, I think maybe one shorthand way to read it is at about what growth percentile would you need to be at in order to achieve the kinds of progress modeled in this table? And so I'm taking a little bit of liberties with that framing, but what it would tell me is if we want a student, of course we do, who starts as unsatisfactory in 3rd grade to be advanced by 8th grade, then we're going to need that student to be on average in the 88th percentile in terms of their progress, which is really favorable growth. But using another example, let's say a student, I don't know, starts at basic in 3rd grade and we want them to stay basic. Of course, we always want students to move up, but that's that's typical growth. That's at about the 49th percentile. You see there in the middle of the table. We'll keep a student at basic. So that's another way maybe that helps people understand the data we're seeing.
So Chris, also, do we know what that looks like as far as point values go? So I get that it has to be at the 76th percentile, but what does that mean in terms of actual improvement? And that changes year to year because of where the percentiles are.
Right. So do you mean in terms of actual VAM scores, the actual VAM residual that's required?
I don't think so. So what I'm looking at is if a student's an unsatisfactory and we want them to be to mastery 5 years later,
Mm-hmm.
and they have to perform at the 76th percentile on average, what does that look like in terms of absolute performance or improvement? Like, I think I have a few other questions too, but what does it mean to be performing at the 31st percentile? What does it mean to be performing at the 58th percentile?
Right. So there's a lot possibly embedded in that question. I want to be as helpful as I can. So one, we could think of it in terms of framing like assessment scale scores, LEAP scale scores. And Thomas or others tell me if I'm mistaken, but I believe 750 is the cut for mastery. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. So one framing is we could just look at what kind of absolute scale score requirements or would we need to observe across the years, and maybe embedded in your question is how might that fluctuate across years, which would be a question about the vertical coherence of the assessment. So maybe we should just sort of take a note to look for that. Is maybe another way to say it is kind of what does that staircase look like in terms of scale scores? Are some of the steps really high? Are some of the steps sort of low? And where do we see along that progression where it takes more or less relative rigor? But yeah, and I think the other way we could look at it is look at just we could look at VAM scores, as I noted earlier, or we could look at this from a lens of percentiles on each of those given years. So it looks like there's a number of lenses that could help us shed some light on your good question there.
Okay, and then my second question, observation is that the previous chart that you showed by awarding points, right now under the current system, a student that is an unsatisfactory in 3rd grade and an unsatisfactory in 8th grade will be consistently earning 25 points for their school every year over the 5 years on average, right? And likewise, a student that was
in that 20 to 39 band.
Right. And so likewise, a student that was approaching that dropped down to unsatisfactory on average is at the 23rd percentile, which is also earning the school 25 points, even though the student is going down in performance. Am I accurate in that statement?
Could you say the last statement one more time?
The 3rd grader who's approaching, so above unsatisfactory, but approaching, that is approaching in 3rd grade and then drops down to unsatisfactory by 8th grade is still in that percentage band where they're earning points for their school.
Yeah.
Okay.
I follow your point.
Chris, can you clarify, or somebody, can you clarify, are these percentiles of residuals?
That's my understanding, is that they're looking at the VAM residual and assigning it a percentile, and that's what you're seeing in these cells.
Right. All right.
Can I ask a question just from you guys as you're looking at the numbers as we see that very few of our students that are in the unsatisfactory or even approaching basic category in the 3rd grade are making it to advanced. And to be honest, not very many are making it to mastery compared to their peers.
Mhm.
Do you think that that is a function of how far behind so many of our students are starting when they enter kindergarten? I just find it hard to believe that our schools are not moving kids, right, and educating kids. I guess I've never really liked the fact that our schools that are serving the most at-risk and ill-prepared kids to start kindergarten function so poorly in our accountability system. And it's a function of how far behind their kids are when they're starting. I don't know, when you look at this table and you see how few kids are making it to mastery and advanced, what do you think?
Well, the data wouldn't give us any sense for the causes here. And I will say that I don't find it astonishing compared to what I've seen in other states. It does take exceptionally favorable growth for students that start well below expectations to progress to expectations. I've seen that in multiple state growth models. So, here is an example. If you start as unsatisfactory or even approaching, typical growth, meaning growing at about the same rate as your academic peers, won't get you there. It won't get you to mastery. You'd have to grow in the case of unsatisfactory to mastery in the top quartile. You'd have to be among the top 25% of your academic peers in terms of growth. So these are aggressive for students who start well below the standard. And that's not too unusual from what I've seen in some other states. But of course, it really speaks to the both norm and criterion views of growth that almost every state tries to square, which is to say, we care about understanding what typical growth looks like, but we also want to make sure it's, quote, growth to somewhere, that it's a growth rate that will get a student to a level of performance that is that meets the state's targets for high performance. So yeah, I didn't answer your question, but just a couple of reflections from what I've seen.
No.
Maybe people will have some reflections to offer.
I mean, Chris, there's two observations. I'm stuck because I'm so used to the student growth percentiles,
Right.
which is it's different, right? And so I'm trying to break out of that framing of this. But like, for example, two things that kind of jump out at me. One is the advanced to advanced.
Mhm.
Even there, those kids are, in order to maintain that advanced standing across 3 through 8, you have to be at the 68th percentile in terms of your residual, which I'm trying to get my head around that.
And I just
The other piece
over to math,
and
it's at 80, it's at 82 for mathematics. So yeah.
So that's, I mean, again, that's puzzling to me. But to answer the question, I'm not sure who was asking that last question. It's also interesting that even for the lowest category, the UNS category, that 2/3 of the kids are moving out of that over the course of 3 through 8. And I think if I did my math right, a quarter of them are moving from the lowest category up to the basic or above, which I haven't seen those numbers in other states, like, the actual concrete numbers, but that seems pretty good to me. I mean, I know we want everyone to get up to mastery, but the reality of what teachers and students are struggling with, to get 2/3 of them to move up at least one category, and a quarter of them to move up to basic or above seems pretty decent.
That's across 5 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So
But it's basically at the end of 5 years. That's where the kids are sitting. Correct. That's how I understand that.
So my reflections on this go back to the original question is, what does improvement look like in absolute terms at the 76th percentile or the 70th percentile? And what is it that is the expectation? And I think part of my concern is yes, it's good that a quarter of the kids move to basic, but if mastery is considered grade level, and grade level mastery, you have very, very few kids that you tell them if they come in at third grade, if they're unsatisfactory or approaching, there's nothing we're going to be able to do to get you up to mastering the state standards in 5 years. So I think when I'm looking at this, I think it's a hard message to sell that over 5 years, moving 2/3 of the kids is a good thing. And not knowing what those absolute point values are for that actual movement. So I would be interested too in seeing what is the actual movement, but then also having a system where people are more clear about what the expectations are year after year, rather than trying to muddle through what it means, looking at these charts with average BAM scores and where kids are moving. I mean, this is as much a school improvement issue and what you do, but the numbers have to be meaningful to educators and policymakers to know what the actual problem is. You know, looking at being at the 70th percentile is a real chore, right? But what does the 70th percentile represent? And is that a high enough expectation that we're setting for teachers to accomplish with students? So it's hard for me to say this is good or bad because I don't know what it means to be consistently at the 58th or 70th or 76th percentile, especially if performance has been on a downtrend since COVID.
Well, the one thing that I can say is I did quick back of the napkin on this. If you start at 650 and you've got to get to 750 and you have 5 years, you have to grow 20 points a year to get from third grade at unsatisfactory to eighth grade at mastery. So it's averaging 20 scale score points a year. And I guess it could be more. It certainly could be more some years and less other years, depending on the assessment and all that different type of stuff.
One of the Christy, one of the challenges to I think the way that you're framing the question is the meaning of the percentile. And I mean, what's odd about this model in my mind is what the percentile really represents is how much error is in the equation, because that's what the residual is, right? The residual is how much error is there in the student's predicted score from what they actually achieved, which is I just think that's an odd way of thinking about the percentile. Right. So kids who are moving, from UNS to basic, basically on average, the amount of error in the formula associated with that group of kids, that 884 kids, falls into the 70th percentile. Now, if the equation gets more accurate, that would change. Like that percentile would change because the residuals would end up getting smaller only because the function is accounting for more variance and therefore getting more accurate. So it's a long way of saying, I think it's really hard to really interpret what these percentiles mean given what they're based on. Whereas and I'm not advocating that the state move to a student growth percentile, but student growth percentile is actually telling you how you're performing relative to other kids who performed like you in the past. And there's no equation. It literally is just a strict comparison. of how you perform relative to other kids who performed like you in the past.
We have a board member who'd like to ask a question or speak.
Yeah, just to maybe a few questions, but I want to ask a clarifying question first because I didn't make the first meeting. I'm looking at the numbers on the screen. I want to make sure I understand them. So when I look at, for example, in the bottom table, number of students, when I see unsat on the left-hand side and then advance in the top in the row, does that mean that's 12 students that started off unsat that moved to advance? Is that right?
Accurate.
And so of the students who started off unsat in third grade, 280 moved to mastery, 884 moved to basic, 1577 moved to approaching basic, and 1703 stayed the same. Correct?
Correct.
So then the follow-up questions along with, and Christy, because I might mispronounce your last name. Pardon me from calling you just Christy. I wonder what's the takeaway from those numbers then? So we, from a board perspective, we're not just solving for creating the best formula, but for the sake of creating a formula, but how do we problem solve for improving outcomes for children? And what do we learn from this? One, is there, going back to Chris, your comment about this is what it looks like in other states. We see a similar trend in other states. I'd like to understand that a little bit better. And then the why, and then who is doing a better job of improving on these numbers. If we, Louisiana, have the lion's share staying in unsat and approaching basic, and a smaller number basic, mastery, and advanced, who's doing it better? Why are they doing it better? And what can we dig into to learn more in terms of what are the factors that contribute to it? And folks might say, well, people on this call and in this meeting, that's not what we're here to solve for. But I'd like to certainly understand that a little bit better, because the question is, why do we use this accountability system? What is it supposed to be used for? What do we do with it? So I kind of voice these questions because at the end of the day, we want to come up with a way of improving the system, but what do we use it for? And I'm sure Mr. Lambert and Dr. Brumley have all sorts of answers to that question. And I know we're working on some of those things, but I'd like to have a deeper understanding of what is it that we use this information for. We spend a lot of time at the board level fighting over what's the right weight. But then the question is, well, given that we have an accountability system, what do we use it for? How are we using it? And what can we take from it to improve from year to year? I know you all do that a lot deeply in the department, but.
Well, so one thing, this accountability formula is used to identify schools that are in need of additional support. And generally that's in terms of funding and support plans and all those types of things. Growth is included as a way of identifying and accounting for the differences in students who start farther behind, but make progress toward reaching expectations. And our whole accountability formula is built around the idea that kids are going to reach that mastery point. And Mike's comment about this is not atypical when we look across states. I think that's true. However, for Louisiana with Louisiana having so many students that are farther behind, Louisiana, if we want our students to be on grade level, we are going to have to move faster than the rest of the nation. So I think I answered part of your question.
No, you did, and then the question is how do we move faster? And then so that's part of the question, and the question is, why aren't we moving faster? So if you go back to Dr. Davis's point earlier, if we have students who start so far behind, and we have a large number that start off unsatisfactory, what can we do to problem solve it? Though we've been working on those things with early childhood education and those sorts of things. But I just think that those are two important questions that we'd have to tackle.
Yeah, I'll say at a foundational level, the science of reading is a really important function that we are working through, that we're trying to get every teacher educated and trained on that. And that will help move literacy scores over time. We're working on plans for math and math interventions. I think that ultimately I think the question here is, how should we measure and value growth? And what is the end goal of having this growth measure? In this conversation, it feels like it is part of how we're going to use it in accountability. And one thing that this table was built based off of a question that Christy asked, that was, we spent a lot of time wrapping our brain around how to answer the question, like, are kids getting to mastery? And we finally arrived at this very hard to read and understand chart that we hope is helpful, that you can see that if a school is getting a kid from the unsatisfactory category to mastery, they are significantly exceeding our state's pace of improvement. And one of the foundational components of what people talk about with growth is they come into these two categories. Are they doing better than average, or are they getting kids to proficiency? And the two things sit in fundamental tension with each other. If your goal is to get kids to proficiency, you're seeing here that a student that starts in the unsatisfactory category basically has to meet their step one target all the way through, and they'll be at the 76th percentile at that point.
But for me, when I look at this, if I was a teacher, this chart would be incredibly demoralizing. Essentially we have one elementary school full of kids that does what it's supposed to do, right? If you think about the 280 plus 12, right, where kids are growing from unsatisfactory to mastery or advanced. And so this chart would be incredibly demoralizing to me if I was a new teacher in a school that was full of kids that were going to show up not ready for kindergarten, and in all likelihood going to test unsatisfactory on their first leap in the third grade. And so in my mind, thinking about how we ought to be valuing growth is recognizing that a highly effective teacher is going to struggle to meet the goals that we have set in front of him or her, given this data.
Maybe I don't want to jump in too soon, but I'm just thinking, if we're looking at a third grader and how they've improved by eighth grade, we assume that that eighth grader, when we give the score to the school, has been in that school the entire time. So school systems all across the state have different models. Not many of them have K-8 models. Some have K-5, some have K-4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so by design of the school system, the students are switching schools. And that's not even to factor in the fact that kids just move for lots of reasons. And depending on the socioeconomic status of the kids, they move even more. How do we account for those sorts of changes? Because we're grading the school and the individual teacher at the eighth grade level, but on that performance of that student in that year. But how is there a way to factor in those variables that I'm sure we don't account for in our system?
I think this is getting to the topic probably at the end of the discussion, which is, what are the values around growth that folks want to prioritize? Our VAM model does seek to take into account student mobility, economically disadvantaged status, all of those different types of things. What you're seeing here is all of that taken into account. What percentile did the student have to be at, controlling for all of those things to get to mastery?
It does take that into account?
Mm-hmm.
How does it do that?
It looks at the expected score that the student should get based off of their prior achievement. and then it adjusts. Yeah, Chris is going to go back. It adjusts for each of these different characteristics, and then they get a residual, and then that gets lined up and it becomes a percentile. And what you're seeing on that chart that we just went through is what was the average percentile that that student had to be in? How much did they have to exceed their peers that looked like them, had experiences like them in terms of disability status, level of poverty, etc. But it still has the fundamental, that chart still has the fundamental expectation that when you're looking at it, that they're getting to, or not the expectation, it's showing you where did they get to. Students who were in the unsatisfactory category and got to mastery, on average, they exceeded their peers by 70 at the 76th percentile. They grew more.
Okay.
So maybe if I may, I'm gonna go ahead and advance it to the mathematics. We can continue to hear comments and questions and reflections in the context of the mathematics data. Christy, I saw you had your hand up a moment ago. So do you want to?
So my favorite question was asked is, what do we do with this data and what's the purpose of accountability systems, right? The data isn't going to change or improve results. It's what you do and use that information for that will change and improve results. And one of the things your accountability system can do is incentivize behavior. And right now, behavior is not entirely incentivized if we're awarding points for students staying in the same place they were after being in school for 5 years. And I understand that there are a lot of students that might come to school a little bit unprepared, but they have been in the system for 4 years before they earn that unsatisfactory score on their 3rd grade assessment. So we've had 4 years of prep with these kids doing K-3 reading programming and math programming before they even take that initial assessment. And so when I look at this data, Thomas, one of the things I think would be really helpful is to look at what percent of students, as I think Mike tried to highlight first and agree, is 38% of students who start 3rd grade ELA unsatisfactory will still be 38% of students will be still unsatisfactory at the end of 8th grade. So for 5 years, you're going to be able to tell parents, if your kid's in my class, 38% of your kids that are unsatisfactory are still going to be unsatisfactory at the end of time. When we flip to the math data, that jumps up to 61%. 61% of kids that start in unsatisfactory in math end up in unsatisfactory in math in 8th grade. I think it's 92% that are unsatisfactory in 3rd grade are unsatisfactory or approaching by 8th grade. So the question is, what do you do with that information? It's making sure that you have the program and supports in place, but also that your accountability system transparently measures growth. So teachers and parents and policymakers can understand what it means to take the next step to approaching, what it means to take the next step to basic, not just exceeding expectations. And I do hear about trying to control for a lot of things that are currently in the VAM system to look at student income and disability and language status. But effectively what that does is set lower expectations for the lower performing students, which means they're never going to catch up. So the way the growth model right now, it provides schools points and incentives for outcomes that aren't meaningful to kids. So you have a lower expectation for lower performing kids because they're being compared to other lower performing kids that also aren't making progress. So there's no incentive for educators or schools or principals or even policymakers to make changes because schools still look like they're performing okay because compared to their peers or expectations of what their peers are doing, they're exceeding those or meeting those, but it's still not going to be enough to get them out of that unsatisfactory category. So there was a lot of really good discussion, a lot of really good questions asked, and you know, it's just people need to be incentivized through the accountability system. And then we need to provide that support, as Thomas was saying afterwards, with K-3 reading initiative and more comprehensive math policies.
So could I invite, thank you very much, Christy. And this is great. I mean, it's exactly what I think we wanted to do, is have good information that helps stimulate really important discussions. So this has accomplished that. But I think Christy's getting into some broader reflections about where this might take us in terms of feedback on growth. So I just want to see if, and also we're just way behind schedule. So could we pause here and we can continue to go through a lot of additional information we have for you, and we do have time at the end to
Chris, may I make a comment, please?
of course.
Very good point, Christy, about this information. This is the first time that I see the comparisons from 3rd through 8th, which is very, very helpful. But in my mind, as an elementary administrator, supervisor, et cetera, I see it as, my approach back then was that I see that we need to focus on early childhood K through 2nd to prep them to get to that point of 3rd grade. If you were talking about, oh, what are we going to do now? 3rd grade is here. We haven't seen any progress and we want to intervene. The intervening it's too, I don't say it's too late, but we need to be proactive in the K1 and 2 for them to be prep ready to make the basic, proficiency, mastery, and advance.
Absolutely agree with you. Unfortunately, we already have kids in the system, and we do need to do something too between now and 8th grade for all these incoming classes too. But totally agree. Those early years are imperative to get right.
Okay, I'm going to keep us moving. Again, don't want to cut off any of the great conversations and reflections. But more very.
I think Chris froze. Hey, Chris, it looks like you froze from here in Baton Rouge. I guess one of the other Chris's gets to take over. I'm sure he'll be back.
Well, while we're waiting, Mr. Lambert, it'd be a good opportunity for me to explain my tardiness. So apologize to the group. Had a little car trouble with a dead cell phone, and you can't charge a cell phone if the battery doesn't work in your car. So apologies, but we're able to work through that and make the meeting. But apologies to everyone for my tardiness.
Yeah.
And get out of the hot seat.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Maybe one of the members of our distinguished panel of experts could give Chris a call. You guys have his number, since my cell phone's not working right now.
Yeah, I will give him a call right now and see.
While we're waiting for him to hop back on, Christy, can I ask you a question? So where is what you want to see happening happening, right? So you basically said where is there a state that is consistently moving kids that are starting out unsatisfactory and moving them to advanced or mastery?
I don't know if you can say that they've started out unsatisfactory, since assessments don't start till third grade, but a lot of the early reading, science of reading initiatives are really important in order to improving those. States like Mississippi, we've worked on their accountability system. I've been working with them for the past 12 years now, and they have a transparent, criterion-based, rigorous growth system built into their accountability system. And they've moved from being the 49th and 50th state in the nation on NAEP to being in the middle of the pack on averages, but to being in the top 10s for free and reduced price lunch, Black students and Hispanic students. So their overall performance in just 10 years of implementation has gone from among the worst in the nation, or you can say the worst in the nation, 50th, all the way up to besting the national average. Florida did the same thing just over 20 years ago. When I worked in the state of Florida, we implemented a system that incentivized only growth and performance that benefited the student. So if the outcome wasn't meaningful to a student, the school didn't get any credit for it in its accountability system. There have been a number of research studies that have demonstrated, Florida specifics, it was the first model done, that having that incentive actually did help improve performance and student gains. So Florida too has moved from being at the very bottom of the nation back in the 90s to when we implemented the accountability systems by 2010 was in the top 10 across the board, and starting to maintain those tracks as well. Utah is another state that went from being middle of the pack in the nation to now they're top 10 across the board as well. So there are a number of states that have figured out how to use data and information to drive their policy decisions, but also only to incentivize outcomes that are beneficial to students in their accountability system. So only things that benefit kids are things that schools would earn points for. And the other kind of commonality is they have the same expectations for all students. So there's no controlling for really anything except for prior year scores in their calculations. And it's looking at, are they improving incrementally year over year? And they have to perform at a higher achievement level than they did in prior years for the school to get credit.
I just spoke to Chris, and he said he hopes to be on in the next 60 seconds.
So, Mr. Lambert, in the next 45 seconds or so, understand what's going on in the lower table with number of students. We're showing progress relative to a starting point. Can you just briefly explain to me this average VAM score table, how to interpret that?
Tell me are you looking at the one that says math at the top or ELA?
I'm looking at the one that says ELA.
Okay. So if you look at the top one and you see in the left column UNS, and in the top row UNS,
yep,
that is students who started in third grade with an unsatisfactory score, and by eighth grade still had an unsatisfactory score. That number is the average VAM percentile for students who stayed in the unsatisfactory category. So going to the right, students who started unsatisfactory and got to approaching basic, they were about average 58th percentile, basic average 70th percentile, mastery 76th percentile. Underneath it, that tells you how many kids there were in that, how many kids percentiles were averaged.
Okay, so bottom line, it's percentiles what we're looking at.
Yep.
Got it. Thank you.
So colleagues, I'm back. I am so sorry. I have no idea. I think my Wi-Fi just went kaput for a little bit. So I assumed all these issues were solved while I was gone.
Appreciate the positive attitude.
Yeah, thank you for your patience. Hopefully that won't happen again. I didn't mean to interrupt anything. Is it okay if I move on, or was there something that needed to be tied up before we do?
But you have the ball.
Okay, thank you very much. So before I dropped, again, many apologies. We were just starting to look at this next set of information. Broadly speaking, this is put together to answer the question, how can we understand the growth targets with respect to selected student groups? Now, there's a lot of groups. We could have done this a lot of different ways. But let's just take these groups that you see in the rows. You've got students who are at mastery or above, below mastery, students that are economically disadvantaged, English learners, Section 504, gifted, students with disabilities. Those are the rows. And you see the number of students that met their growth target. They got a VAM score that was north of 0, meaning that they performed at least as well as their target or higher. So you see the number of students that did that in the count, you see the total of those students in that category, and you see the percent. And so maybe the way to shorthand this table for everybody is we're interested really in seeing if and to what extent those differ across groups. So you can see most of those values are very near 50. So you can see in most cases about half the students meet the target, about half the students don't meet the target. But we would be inspired to reflect in particular if there was a group that only a small percentage of those students met the target, or a very high percentage of students met the target in comparison with other groups. It might suggest something. And again, now here we're getting into some of the issues that Christy and others were giving voice to earlier. So I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth or assume any particular perspectives about what you value with growth. But one point of view could be that well, I'll just say both. One point of view could be that, is there a model specification issue we need to attend to? Another point of view would be we're seeing something that is accurately reflecting reality. So without putting my thumb on the scale, that's sort of two things that people might comment on when they see those observe the differences in percentages here. So as I looked at this beforehand, and I know that people are coming to this fresh, there are a few areas that stand out. In general, the students who are mastery and above are meeting their growth targets at higher rates, not in every case, but in some cases, like for algebra, here's 62% are meeting that. And again, you can scan and see. I don't want to read every column, every row, but. And then the difference between the panels, by the way, is the first panel is 22, 23, and the second panel is 21, 22. So same information, just two different years. But many times in technical conversations, folks want to see how is this playing out by student groups. And so this is intended to help answer those questions, friends.
So Chris, what's the takeaway from this slide?
I think the takeaway is, and I would expect this in Louisiana, Louisiana's model has a lot of covariates in it. And Christy was reflecting on that earlier. And in general, those are serving to have relatively equivalent rates of meeting targets across different student group categories, with some modest exceptions. Go ahead, Christy.
So, very dumb
Oh,
question.
sorry, go right there.
But what is the growth target for mastery and above?
Maintaining mastery. Well, in this case, if we're talking about residuals, what we're talking about is performing at a level consistent with academic peers, which would be should be more than well suited to maintain mastery. That's probably an open question, though.
Well, that gets to my question. I'm trying to understand what these numbers are because meeting exceeding growth targets could be different than residual greater than zero. Right. So is it, again, if I understand this correctly, residual
Mhm.
greater than zero, I mean, in theory, all these numbers should add up to 50%. Half the residuals should be above zero and half of them should be below if the regression function is working. Right.
Yeah.
So you would expect on average that it would be 50%. That why and why you're seeing sometimes it's greater than and sometimes it's less than 50% for any one category is because I believe you have so many coefficients in here. So really what you're doing is looking at, not you, but when we're looking at this table, when you look at like English learners, section 504, gifted, and so forth, we're thinking those are being defined as like single axis categories, but the regression function operates intersectionally. So
Yeah,
unless
and
you are only section 504, that's why these numbers are not all 50%. But if you were only falling into if you could only be in one of those categories, all these numbers should be 50%.
Yeah, I think, let me say that another way. I think that's right. If these were mutually exclusive categories, and you were conditioning on all those categories consistently, then we would expect to be 50%. But you might be a student who's a language learner, and one student was very mobile, another student wasn't. And so you're going to see different patterns of performance. So the fact that you're getting multiple conditions within these relatively arbitrary definitions are going to give you some deviations from 50. Yeah.
I keep asking this question in different ways. Thomas said that on average to go from 650 to 750, you'd have to make 20 points a year to go from unsatisfactory to mastery from 3rd grade to 8th grade. What is my growth target, or what is the point value equivalent to the residual of 0 for a student who is mastery and above? What are we expecting a student who is mastering content to do to be demonstrating growth or have a residual greater than 0?
And I'm trying to think of what data we need to answer that, Christy. I think one way to answer it would be to take a student maybe at different starting places, maybe a student who's at each level, unsatisfactory, approaching, and look at a 50th percentile or right at maybe a residual of 0. So that's a student who grows comparably with his or her academic peers, and see what their progression across time is. That kind of gets us back to our staircase example. So you could see what kind of scale score gains would you observe? Is it 20 every year? Or is it 15 one year, 25 the next, this kind of thing? So yeah, I don't know the answer, but I think it's useful for us to think about what would help inform that question for you.
Yeah, and the reason I keep asking this question and keep driving this point home is because if you continue to expect what has been happening, there's no incentive for making things better.
And it sounds like one of the things you're worried about, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so you should tell me if this isn't a fair statement, is would it be the case that a student, quote, meeting their growth target at that residual of 0, that there's a very different progression across years for, say, that student with disabilities than for a student who's not classified as having disabilities? And if that's the case, is that a problem?
That's part of my question. I think my bigger question is if we're setting this up, a system that's going to incentivize growth and improve student outcomes, I think we need to be sure that what we're incentivizing at a residual of 0 or 50% growth, or however we want to talk about it, is something that is going to be meaningful to get that student to the next level or to mastery. And if Thomas says we need 20 points a year every year to go from unsatisfactory to basic or mastery, unsatisfactory to mastery. And we're awarding points, full points to every school for every student that is at the residual, and the residual of 0 is equivalent to 7 points. Are we incentivizing the right thing? Because what we're doing right now is setting expectations based on what is happening, not what we want to happen. And if we base expectations on what we want to happen, behavior has to change, and schools have to be incentivized to change that behavior in order to see results. So I understand the technical merits of showing this data and information, but I don't understand the practical application of it on what we're trying to accomplish with this growth panel, because this information to me is very meaningless to know how it's going to push forward an agenda that's going to improve student achievement in Louisiana.
Yeah, I follow your point, and I take it that you are prioritizing a growth to standard model much more than a normative model.
I'm prioritizing a model that's going to improve Louisiana achievement. And I think that as we continue to compare to other Louisiana students who aren't performing where we want them to, we're going to continue in this cycle of expecting what we're getting rather than expecting more. And how does this information translate into changing outcomes?
Yeah, I take your point, and yeah, I'll just stop there. I take your point. Thank you very much.
Chris, can I just build on that comment? Again, privately, I sent you a note about trying to see what one of these regression models look like, what the coefficients are. But and I think to Christy's point, again, if I'm understanding this correctly, the challenge here is because the residuals are based on a number of different categories that a person may or may not fall into, ELL, absenteeism and so forth, that in reality, what's happening is the residual likely has very little relationship to the number of score points that are needed in order for someone to move or progress up categories over time.
Yep.
It's going to be very different, and I think that's one of the challenges in trying to understand how these residuals and the percentiles based on those residuals then correspond in a meaningful way to what do I need to do as an educator, right? What do I need to do as a school with this group of kids that I'm working with? Yeah. And I think that just becomes really challenging. And on top of it, I think, Christy, this is part of what you're not saying, but I hear you inferring it, is that I think this model very well may be setting up, if you're focusing on the percentiles and the residuals, different expectations for different groups of kids. And in reality, lower expectations for those kids who are most disadvantaged.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That's helpful. We're already starting to suss out, I think. So this is illustrating why we have a panel. There just aren't right answers when it comes to these very tough questions. And I think you'll find a range of views about what we're expecting of growth. I think if you ask most people, do you expect, should the model be tethered to a growth progression that's typical for students with similar characteristics? Many people will answer yes. If you ask somebody, should the model require enough growth to get to the target in a reasonable amount of time? Most people will say yes. And those two things require two different growth solutions. So.
And then it just becomes a value-based conversation, which this next board will have to take up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chris, I think I may have said, I can't remember if it was in this board or another tech meeting, but there's a really good article by David Gilborn, 2010, that I think speaks directly to the issue that we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
It's focused on the British system as opposed to a US, but it's exactly the same, where effectively they take into consideration these demographic and to some extent behavioral variables, and it ends up creating these very different expectations for different groups of kids, even though the intent is try to be fair.
Yeah.
By taking into considering these things. By doing that, you end up establishing different expectations. So I just encourage people to, you know, I don't know, Chris, if you want to find it or if I can send it to you, but people to take a look at that.
So
Yeah,
would
did
you
you-
guys be able to provide us some examples where one state is taking one approach, another state's taking a different approach, and these are the kind of outcomes that we see from the different approaches?
Before we finish today, we'll do a little teaser of the different approaches states are using, and absolutely we should unpack those in future meetings. Thank you, Mike, for the reference, and Chris Brandt, maybe, I don't know if you were able to get that. That'd be great if we could pop that in the notes. If not, I'll reach out to you separately, Mike. Christine, you've been patient. I see your hands up.
Thank you very much. And thank you for walking us through the information on the slides. I would say, as it relates to educators and the extent to which the VAM model provides instructional value, to ground the calculation of growth and the expectations of growth in covariates that mitigate expectations according to different characteristics of students provides what I would argue is perhaps very little information about how to approach instruction in a way that drives student success. So no matter how much you tinker and tease with covariates as they relate to the students themselves, and I would just say, you know, the data used in the model could even be further expanded, right? Whether or not the student is in foster care or homeless, like there are other characteristics even mentioned in Louisiana's state plan that are not accounted for here. But as an educator, knowing whether or not, you know, students have access to high-speed internet, whether or not they have up-to-date resources, understanding what the access is of educators to increase their own capacity through accessing professional learning, whether or not they have instructional leadership and access to, you know, ways to differentiate instruction. All of those things are very much going to mitigate and change our expectations of student performance as well. So I would just say that no matter how much we tinker with these covariates about student characteristics, as an educator, when we are consuming this information about how many students moved from you know, approaching to mastery, it's not particularly helpful to us in changing our approach, differentiating instruction, or trying to make improvements that will support students, because it simply doesn't provide the kind of robust information that we need. And I would say that, you know, and this is, I think, the conversation for later, the information that is helpful shouldn't necessarily be considered in a growth model, but can perhaps be incorporated in another way, like, for example, they do in Hawaii. So I'll pause there, but I do understand the points, and they're well taken by my panel colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine. If it's agreeable, I'm going to keep going. I'm aware that we're way behind, and I know we're already getting into such good substantive stuff, and I don't want to do anything to diminish that. Another thing we asked for was year-to-year reliability. Again, you can decide to what extent, colleagues, that this matters to you and your overall assessment of the model. But is generally intended to answer the question, how much stability year to year? So what we have is just looking at 2022 to 2023 for schools or sites. You see the numbers there in the far right column. What's the correlation between the growth score in year one and the growth score in year two? And you see those correlations range from, it looks like 0.42 to 0.67. In my judgment, these are higher than I typically see, meaning these results are more stable. Usually the results I've seen are closer to the low fours across the board. You might ask, what's good? What do we want to see? I have no idea how to answer that. I think, some people will hold the view that if the correlations are very low, then what that means is schools are seeing a lot of bounce, a high growth score one year, a low growth score another year. And then that leads to a question about, is that a deficiency in the model, or is that really what's happening in the school? And that's a really hard question to answer. Other people will say if there's a high correlation, if it's more like 0.8 or 0.9, then that's troubling because it shows that it's not sensitive to changes, that it's almost deterministic. So I think in general, when we inspect these, we just want to see, is it within a range that is consistent with what we often observe for well-established defensible growth models. I think the answer here in Louisiana is yes. If anything, it's a little higher, but you should do with that what you will. There's a reason why we have judgment baked into this process. Let me pause here to see if there are questions or comments.
Just curious, see if I have the right interpretation. This is a Cohen's d calculation, Dr. Davis?
This is just a Pearson correlation.
Thank you. Inside joke.
Okay, I will keep moving. I particularly like this graph that the department put together. I always think it's really important to do some kind of examination, and the panel gave voice to this in our August meeting, that looks at the relationship between status and growth. And I think this is as good a portrait as I've seen in similar examinations. What we're looking at across the x-axis is the school accountability, or SPS score, the school performance score. And you see those also banded by grades, with F on the left and A on the right. And you see average student growth for those sites on the y-axis. So each dot is going to be a site, and it's going to show the intersection of their SPS score and their growth score. Again, you may be asked, well, what do we want to see here? In general, what we want to see is a relatively, and again, somebody may disagree with me here, and they should give voice to that if that's the case, but in generally, we want to see a low correlation here. We want to see that growth is picking up on something different, that it's not just reifying or a redundant version of status. And so the fact that here the correlation, just a Pearson correlation, is 0.12, that's a tiny little box on the right, shows that there's not a strong positive relationship here at all. Another way you might look at this is you might look at SPS bands of F, D, C, B, and A, moving from left to right, and you might ask yourself, do I see a full spread of growth scores in each of those bands? So can schools that are A access high growth? Can schools that are F access high growth? Do we see a full range there? And this is one portrait that shows a fairly uniform spread across schools at each point on the SPS scale. I'm going to pause for questions or comments.
I guess my my comment and question is just clarification here that growth is not defined the same for every student. Is that accurate?
Could you say more about that?
Well, when we consider all the covariants, and growth is assessed relative to peer growth, just want to get clear in my mind if we're comparing apples to apples. When we talk about the whole population and comparing individuals within the whole population on a quote unquote growth assessment, is growth measurable the same for every student in the population? Do we recognize growth the same for every student in the population?
Right. So because I like to think of it in terms of academic peer groups, students will belong to various academic peer groups in the VAM, in the way that the VAM is implemented in Louisiana. And those are made up of prior scores and various characteristics that we've talked about. And so it is true that once we situate a student in an academic peer group, that peer group gets a trajectory, gets a prediction, and then your deviation from that prediction is the residual, and it's the mean of those residuals that we're seeing modeled on the y-axis here. So I think it's a long way, Mr. Morris, of saying yes, it's different for students based on their academic peer group.
Right. So we would be looking at a different visual if we were just comparing raw growth relative to every student.
Oh, if we had a different model, we just looked at something like a subtraction on a vertical scale or something like that.
No, I'm just saying, well, let's just put it simple. Let's say if you didn't consider any covariates.
Oh, yes, I think we would see different results. Yes.
The scatter graph would look quite different.
I think there'd probably be a stronger correlation with SPS scores.
Got it. That's what I was trying to get to.
And also, even if you did a student growth percentile, wouldn't that still take into account where the kids started? So you would so you would still have a similar challenge. It would be less so, Mr. Morris, but that's why Chris was saying the going to a straight subtraction vertical scale actually gets you closer to what you're talking about. If you do student growth percentiles, you're still adjusting for where the students started.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Thank you.
Yep. Which that could be a whole different topic of conversation. I was actually thinking about it when Christine was offering her comments, which I think were in service to this idea of parsimony. You know, like what's the right amount to have in the model without being, I guess, superfluous. But maybe we'll just put a pin in that. That's a question we should talk about later. I sense Christy would have an opinion about that. She's nodding. Okay. Okay. All right. And then here we see, oh, these are, different years. So the first is the 21-22. This is 18-19. Very similar results. So I won't linger here unless people want me to. I think we had good discussion along the way, so perhaps we don't need to pause here too long, but I do feel like I should pause before we shift to the next topic, which is really looking at some characteristics of the LEAP assessments. Well, in the interest of time, I'll keep going. Maybe we can get through the LEAP information, which I think will go a little faster just because there's a little less nuance to talk about, but there are some important things. So I do want to make sure we give that time. And also we tried to bake in a little break in the agenda. So maybe we'll see.
Shan is not here to remind us, so I am going to channel my inner Shan. We're going to need a motion to go to the next item.
Can I get a motion to go to the next item? Members, Dr. Davis, and I got a second, Mr. Castillo. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Lambert. You have the ball, Chris.
Okay, thank you, sir. So the primary questions that the panel raised in August was we wanted to learn more about the distribution and the precision of LEAP scores. And not to put too fine a point on it, I think what the panel is wisely recognizing is we can't really fully talk about the model without also talking about the assessments that are used in the model. And there may actually be, in some cases, limitations to any model if we have if there are certain characteristics of the assessments that we observe. So what we're going to look at right now is two different kinds of information. We're going to look at a histogram so we can see the range of performance or the spread across the scale. And we're going to look at the conditional standard error of measure so we can see how precise scores are across the range. And I'll go through that. There'll be a lot of repetitive graphs. So even though there's a lot of slides here, I won't linger on any one of them too long because they're showing the same thing for different tests. So here we're looking at histograms for ELA in grades 5 and 8. Across the x-axis, we're just looking at the scale scores from low to high. And the y-axis or vertical axis, we're looking at the count or the number of students who earned that score point. And then you see the a normal curve superimposed on that, and then the kernel that superimposed on that is a attempt at smoothing based on the distribution that we're looking at. So in general, you see a pretty broad spread of scores. I don't make too much, I don't think, of those spikes that occur in the middle of the distribution. That probably just means that there's some scale scores across various forms that are where you just see more student scoring at those ranges. It may be about what I call sort of the coarseness of the scale, and that you don't often observe a full spread of scale scores on any state test. Now, one of the things I know that you might, your eyes might focus on, and mine certainly did when I looked at it, is the spikes here at the tails. I do think that's worth lingering on, and that's something we talked about a little bit internally before this meeting. So here, this is LEAP English 2. And you see that there's a pileup, for lack of a better technical term, there's a pileup of scores here at the lowest obtainable scale score and the highest obtainable scale score, particularly at the lowest obtainable scale score. And that's something that we'll see in some others of these histograms, which could be due to a number of reasons. And if there's anybody at the LDOE that wants to provide a perspective on this beyond what I'll say, then please do. But it could be due to students who don't fully attempt the test. It could be due to very low performance that's below what we call the loss. So another way to say that is there's a theoretical range of scores. I don't know if you can see my cursor. It's very hard to follow, I bet. There's actually a range of scores that theoretically could be reached below that big spike. But Louisiana does what every state testing program I know does, which is say below a certain threshold, the measurement error is too high to report that score. So we're going to set what's called a loss or a lowest obtainable scale score, and that's the first score that'll be reported. So it tells us that there's some difficulty at the very lowest levels of performance in distinguishing among gradations in performance for some of these forms, which is not a new insight. This is something that I think we've talked about before in Louisiana. And I'll keep going. And again, please, colleagues, jump in at any point as we look at these distributions. Here's mathematics, grades 5 and 8. Algebra and geometry. Science. Again, and generally the statistical term for this is a positive skew, which is more density on the left-hand side. So in general, we're seeing positive skew with, but with pretty good spread along the scale. Biology. So social studies certainly has that a pileup of scores at the loss in a very visually striking way. U.S. history. And I'm going to pause here before we get into conditional standard error of measure. Any
So,
questions or comments?
yeah, just make sure we get clear interpretation of um, your comment on the positive skew, how that should be interpreted.
Yeah, it's kind of counterintuitive to use the word positive because it shows that performance is more prominent at lower scores than it is for higher scores. So so in general, the distributions have more density on the left-hand side and taper off on the right-hand side, but there's still a good spread of scores. So these aren't normal or bell-shaped distributions in the most case, although they have some characteristics of that. That they tend to be generally positively skewed. But again, it's not a norm reference test, so there's no expectation. They weren't built to be to create any kind of bell-shaped or symmetrical distribution.
Okay.
So moving on to conditional standard error of measure. So what we're looking at here are along the x-axis is the scale score from low values to high values. In this case, each colored line is a different ELA test. And on the vertical axis is it's conditional standard error of measure. It's an indication of precision. It means for the scale score, that's the conditional part. For the scale score, it's conditioned on what's the error associated with that. Consistent with most state assessment programs, the error it's designed to have most precision or least error at the cut scores. And here I think we see the cut scores for I think it's basic and mastery. Yeah, basic and mastery here at 700, 750. Is that right?
Approaching basic and mastery.
Thank you, Thomas.
Basic is right in the middle of those two cut points.
Gotcha. And this is one of the reasons I mentioned about the lowest obtainable scale score. You can see the error inflates the more you get to the tails, and there'll be a point at which psychometricians will say there's too much error to report that score. And so it just gets it gets tapered off. But in general, you see most of the forms have very similar conditional standard error of measure. It's most precise around the cut scores as you would expect, and it doesn't peak too much. So in general, what we want to avoid is something that's a very pronounced U. We want something that's a more subdued U, for lack of a better word.
And we're looking at the error between what and what?
It's the error associated with any score on the test. So as an example here at 750, which is the mastery cut, the red dashed is grade 3. It looks like it's a standard error of about 12. I'm just looking at it's a little above 10. Whereas if you scored a 650 on that same test, the error is closer to maybe 22, 23. And from a growth perspective, the reason we're looking at this in a growth conversation is we just want to know that the tests are precise enough along the full range to give good information for growth.
What would be an example of error?
An example of what causes error? I mean, all tests have error, and it just reflects the fact that there's going to be variable performance for students across any occasion. So if you gave Chris Domaleski a parallel form and I took it over and over and over, there's going to be a range at which I'm going to score. Based on the sample of items, based on how I'm feeling that day, based on a number of things. And I mean, one definition of error is, if I took an infinite number of those tests, I'd get a true score. And so the deviation from the observed score for a true score is one definition of error.
Okay.
You can
Over a sample population.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can think of the errors associated with an individual score. And so you could think about, I'm taking a test, I'm reading a question, and on one day I misread one of the words, and so I get the item right. A little bit later, I'm not sure about an answer. I make a guess, I get the item, either right or wrong. And so if I get it right and I'm guessing, then I really probably shouldn't have got that right. If I misread a word and get it wrong, if I read the word right, I probably would have got it right, the answer right. So those are errors that are balancing out. But if, over a course of time, sometimes you get 2 or 3 errors that lead to a lower score, 2 or 3 errors that would lead to a higher score. So effectively, that's what this is showing, is how much error is there generally associated with the kid's score given where they're performing
An error
on
from
the scale.
An error from a test perspective here, this is a work against some of the maybe practical interests that folks will have. Longer tests with more items at the same level are going to reduce the error. So if I could give a student 1,000-item test that had, scores and scores of items at every point along the distribution, I'll flatten that U shape,
Right.
but nobody's going to want that.
Right.
So it's just
basic standard error calculation, sounds like, right?
right.
Yeah.
Here we're looking at English 1 and English 2. Again, pretty actually pretty strong view of precision for Louisiana's tests. So getting good information and not too much inflation of error on the tails. I've seen a lot of these in other states that peak a lot more prominently. Mathematics, this one has a little bit more error at the tails, and this is the first time we've seen one that peaks a little bit more at high scores. Frustratingly, in psychometrics, there's not really a threshold to say, how much exactly is in the red zone or whatever. One thing you'll read in the literature is try to keep the error at the tails no more than 3 times what it is at the cuts. It's one rule of thumb, and here this is generally consistent with that. But there's again a fairly precise range of scores on Louisiana's LEAP tests. Algebra and geometry, more error in the lower performing regions. Science. Biology. Social studies. U.S. history. So again, some of these, the social studies looks like it does have less information or more error in the tails compared to some of the ELA tests we looked at in particular. But good news is around the cuts, it's very precise. And I'm going to pause there. I know that was a ton of information, but again, we wanted to follow up on the panel's questions about the distribution and about the precision. So let me see if there are questions, comments, or any responses to some of the prompts that you see displayed here. Hearing none, may I invite us to take a moment to take a brief break before we get into our last agenda item?
Sure. Can I get a motion to take a break? Dr. Davis, Mr. Castile got a second?
No object.
All right, we'll adjourn briefly. We want to say 5 minutes, 10 minutes? What do we want to say?
How about 3:05? So a little less than 10 minutes. Would that work?
3:05. We'll re-adjourn at 3:05. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, because they said you wanted to. Okay. Yeah, but I gotta tell college. Take a bio break. I knew that. I mean,
And they literally were cotton plywood in that dome. I go on. But they do, you know, yes. Ready for that. I mean, if it's done for me, it means I'm a hospital. In some respects, maybe. My mom's gonna be your stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I haven't seen you forever, and I think I'm in love. And I don't. Oh, yeah, yeah.
well, I mean, we're at 305. Yeah, but they're bad.
We wouldn't have waited on it if it wasn't for Shane. Shane, I don't know. We have 3 members here, so we've got a quorum.
Okay, see if we can call us back to order. Do I need a roll call here to see we have a quorum? We're good? No roll calls needed, I'm told. So, are we picking up on another? I don't have an agenda in front of me. Are we picking up on a new agenda item, or are we?
Yes.
All right, can I get a motion to open up, next agenda item? Ms. Holloway, in a second. Dr. Davis, thank you. So Chris, you have the ball, and we are on agenda item 3.3. Is that correct? All right, Chris?
Great, thanks. Thank you, sir. So the last, just to situate everybody to what we're doing with the last hour, it's about 5 minutes after 3 now. We had planned to wrap up at 3:45 to leave time for public comment. So we've got about 40 minutes, a little less, for the last topic. And this is a big shift to what we've been talking about before. Now we're going to step back and take a very broad view of growth. The idea here is to really stimulate conversation about sort of a range of models that the panel suggests focusing on, and which ones we might want to prioritize, if any. And then we may say that the ones that we're talking about today are a good representation of where we should focus our exploration. But what I'll do is, whoops, wrong direction here. What I'll do is spend just I got off track here. Spend just maybe 10 to 15 minutes with some front matter, and then we'll get right into a panel conversation. I always like to start conversations with growth by just situating it within the broader framework, a framework that was originally developed by Daryl Carlson. And this particular table I got from a publication that my colleague Brian Gong put together. And just understanding that there are 4 ways to think about school performance: status, which is a point in time, a measure of performance; improvement, which looks longitudinally. Another word for that could be trend, and the next slide gives examples of this. Growth represents progress across the cohort, and acceleration, I like to think about that as differences in growth rates. And I think this is useful to understand, to make sure that we understand what is growth, what isn't, and what some of the different flavors of growth are. Oh my word, why is it skipping all the way back there? All right, sorry, I'll use a different way to advance these slides. Here are some examples of that. So status would be something like just proficiency rates. What is the percent of 3rd grade students who are proficient at math on the state test in 22? I think everybody's familiar with that. Improvement, I also said that trend is a synonym for that. What's the difference between the percent of students proficient on the state test in 22 compared to 2021? So we'd be looking, for example, at the same grade, same measure, but across 2 different points in time. There are actually 2 states, I don't talk further about them in this presentation, that use an improvement-based measure of growth instead of something that's more classically growth. So it's not unheard of for improvement to be the focus for the way that sort of progress is defined. Growth, this is, as I mentioned a moment ago, progress measure. So how much progress in math did, say, a cohort of 4th grade students make in 22 compared to how they performed 3rd graders. Clearly, Louisiana, the value-added model is an example of growth. And acceleration, as I noted before, would be a comparison of growth rates across a unit of interest, like a school or a group. So I know this is fairly fundamental information, but I thought it would be a good level setting for this conversation. You might ask, what are some common approaches to growth? As we've noted before, there are different ways to ask and answer the question. So a gain score method is, and in the next slide, I'll show you account of which states are using which approaches. A gain scored method simply answers the question, what's the magnitude of progress? You're going to need a vertical scale or some consistent scale in order to do that. A gain score method is just simple subtraction. If you have a vertical scale and the student scores or cohort scores, a mean of 700 in one year and a mean of 720 in another year, then we'd say, well, there's a 20-point difference or a 20-point gain. There's lots we could say about gain scores and vertical scales, more than you probably want to hear me say now, but I'll just leave it at that by way of just setting the table. Growth to standard. Oh, and I should have said this before I got into this. These aren't mutually exclusive. There's some overlap here. So you can have, for example, gain score methods that are also growth to standard, or percentile methods that embed growth to standard. And we can talk more about that. But these are intended to capture some of the primary ways that growth is used to answer questions. So growth to standard approach answers the question, is the student's progress on track? So if you just, one very simple example of this would be something like linear interpolation. If you say, here's the target 3 years out, here's where the student performed this year, or here's where a cohort of students performed this year, then growth would say, what are those incremental values that are required in order to be on pace to reach a target in a reasonable amount of time? And again, there are multiple sort of analytic ways that you can implement a growth to standard. And again, we can talk about that.
Chris,
Another
is our step one an example of growth to standard?
Yes, sir. It is very much.
Good comment, Mr. Lambert. Thank you.
Categorical approach. Sometimes people call these value tables. This looks at transitioning across performance categories. In most of the ways that states implement this is they'll take, let's say the test has 4 performance categories. Usually they create something a little more granular, like they'll take each category and divide it into 2 subcategories. So they'll have a 1A and a 1B and a 2A and a 2B, and they'll put together a transition table or a value table and award points for progress across those units. So if a student goes from 1A to 1B, they get a certain amount of points. So they go to 1A to 3B, a big jump, they get more points. And that's one of the reasons why it got the moniker value table, because you can bake your values in with that. And again, you could say, could I bake my values in with other growth models in other ways? The answer is yes. But this one very explicitly assigns values to different kinds of progression. And one reason many proponents like value tables or categorical growth measures is because they're the meaning or the sort of how to interpret each category is more intuitively clear. So you sort of know what it means to be low proficient and move to high proficient or something like that. So a critique of that method might be, well, it's a little more coarse. You could move within levels and the model wouldn't detect that. So if I can move 5 scale score points, but if I'm still in 3A, then the model doesn't reward that. Growth percentile. How does a student's growth compare to his or her academic peers? The most common model that is a growth percentile model is a student growth percentiles, SGPs. That is similar to a VAM, and I think somebody made this comment earlier, insofar as it just looks at prior performance as the conditioning, and it really focuses the outcome on the percentile. And then regression or value-added models. Again, I realize that probably somebody else could create different categories than these, but this is one way of categorizing this. Because, for example, growth percentiles do use regression-based methods. But the value added has come to mean any instantiation of growth that looks at multiple factors, typically selected because they're thought to be beyond the influence of educators or schools. And again, all of this is probably up for discussion. But the idea is that if you have immutable student characteristics and there are different growth expectations related to those are baked into the model. And doing so, we call those value-added models. Some people will say that value added is more of a verb than a noun. You see my footnote there, that anytime you make an inference where an effect is thought to be attributed to the influence of educators or schools, you're using it in a value added way. But I would say in common parlance, value added has come to mean models that have multiple conditioning factors. And in common parlance, growth percentile has come to be associated with one particular model, the SGP, which is based on prior performance only and highlights the percentile as the outcome of measure. I realize this is a fire hose of information here, but I wanted to just give a very broad sweep of some of the more common approaches to growth.
Oh, this is excellent.
done
Thank you.
Thank you. I've done it again and pressing the wrong button here. So you might ask then, who uses what? So these data, these are the most recent data I could find. And this is from Data Quality Campaign back in 2019. I know there's been some changes since then. And I could speak to some of them in one-offs. We really need a more comprehensive analysis again of who's using what models, but this will give you a flavor because I don't actually think it's massively important to know if there's 21 or 23 states that use student growth percentiles. Just knowing that there are multiple models used by multiple states, and the reason, by the way, that these don't sum to 50 is because some states have multiple models in play in their accountability system. They'll have both a growth to standard and a value added model. And in fact, Louisiana is listed twice in each of those categories because of that very fact. So you see the student growth percentile is the most common, value tables after that, and then you can see the others. And for example, I was just recently doing some work in Delaware. They're listed as other, and they have sort of a hybrid of a gain score and value table model. It just sort of defies easy categorization, which is probably why the Data Quality Campaign gave them other. I do know Illinois is listed as another. They have since moved to student growth percentiles, so that's dated. But there's a picture of what some of the states are, or what the states are using with respect to some of these common models.
So I'd be interested to know why a state chooses a certain model. Is it because of consideration for their student population? Is it just a reflection of their values relative to what other states are doing? Do we have a sense of why they choose one model relative to another, or why not in other cases?
I have multiple parts to an answer, but so I don't take too much oxygen. Do any of the other panelists want to offer a perspective first?
I can offer a perspective. One, it definitely depends on what their aligned values are. The second is just the student growth percentiles. Part of the reason that's such a popularly used model is because the U.S. Department of Education put that in ESEA waiver regulations as an example of how states could do growth. And this was prior to a lot of states using growth. So they specifically cited that. So I know a lot of states knew that if they adopted SGPs, they would probably be approved with their federal plan back in 2014, 15-ish.
Okay.
But generally it should be based on what values the state holds.
Okay. So there's generally no specific consideration for the student population, the demographics, or whatever. There's no correlation between that and a particular model works better for a particular group.
It could be something that you value, right? Like you could value accounting for differences in demographics in the way that your growth measure is working. If you value that, one growth model that you would look at would be the value added because it takes that into account. If that was something that you did not value and you more so valued are students getting to mastery by the time they exit, then you would look more at something like a growth to standard or a value table, both of those are going to have overlap. Does that help, Mr. Morris?
Yeah, I think you answered it right away with the VAM model specifically does that. And the others are really more conceptual rather than especially considerate to some aspect of the student population.
And I think that's part of why Chris is kind of framing this up in this way, because our hope is to get to the end of this with a good set of values for folks to consider as we look at growth models. And you hit the nail on the head with, why would you look at student demographics or characteristics? How do you decide what the right growth model is? So the values really are the important thing for us to kind of get hammered in on at the end of this.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. It really gets to the heart of what we're here to do, because it does tend to be a mix of multiple factors. Absolutely, as Christy and others said, values go into it. For example, there may be a perspective in the state that they want something that has the most sensitivity particularly for detecting certain growth in certain regions of the scale. They could have a value of simplicity or clarity. Sometimes there's a practical issue here. So for example, I think one of the main reasons you see a lot of student growth percentile states is because those information are already being provided, maybe through the test vendor contract. It's also an open source model, whereas a lot of the value added models used are through a commercial provider. So there's just a lot of different reasons that states will choose growth models, and it tends to be a combination of those factors.
Thank you,
Chris. Yeah, I want to point out a little bit about the history of the value edit model. I mean, one of the as I understand the history, and I looked at this back when Sanders first developed the model. Like one of the motivations for it was to try to be quote unquote fairer to schools and teachers who are being held accountable. And part of the logic was because you had different characteristics of students served by schools and therefore the teachers in those schools that varied in a manner that was uncontrollable by the school, I mean, due to the structure of our society, that the value added model was advocated as a way to recognize the differences in the student characteristics served by schools and teachers. But in doing that, the priority was given to fairness to schools and teachers and not necessarily fairness to students. So I think it's really important when you were thinking about this, like the values piece is critically important to informing which model you're going to gravitate towards. But the values for what? Is the value for the student, or is the value for the school and the teacher, or both? And again, like I said, that the initial inspiration for the value added model was trying to be more fair to teachers and schools that were serving different populations, and not necessarily for the students themselves.
That's a great point, making that distinction. Is there any way you can come up with a balance or an offset?
I think that's what most states try to do, right? I think they try to take into account the multiple priorities and try to find approaches that thread this needle as well as possible. But clearly, and I strongly agree with Mike's point, clearly you have to be guided by some sense of values in order to make a principled decision.
Maybe I'm just throwing this out there. Maybe one way to do that is to put more weight on growth. So if you can accurately measure growth, and you do have a very diverse student population. Some students are starting, well behind the starting line. So they have significant amount of growth potential. And if you can capture that growth potential, then you are recognizing real growth, and the teachers and the schools get credit for that real growth. But at the same time, you recognize, well, maybe that student's still not at grade level. Is that a conversation, or am I just reaching too far?
The you get into these tensions, these values that sit in tension with each other, and there's got to be weight put onto where you feel the right, what value gets the most weight, because you can't have both of, well, I don't know of a way that you can have truly both of the things. You can have both of the things over time. You can have it once in third grade, and then in fourth grade, something different can happen. And then you've got one thing one year and one thing the next year. But if you fundamentally believe that the accountability system should be getting a kid to mastery, the only real way to do that, well, there's only a few ways to do that, and none of them really take into account student characteristics, is what I would say. So I think that it's a really hard place to dig into, and really talking about what those values are, so that y'all can kind of wrap your head around the things that sit in tension and put your own weight on those things as you think about these things.
Well, I think, from my seat, you certainly want to incentivize growth, right? And given the student population that we're talking about, again, there's a lot of students that aren't at the starting line, the official starting line. We want to get them there, and we want to incentivize schools and teachers and so forth, to get them there. And we want to recognize the fact they are getting them there. And so in my mind, there's certainly fairness in that. And then you want to be fair to students and recognize, yeah, well, you are at grade level or you're not at grade level. That's reality. And everybody's going to graduate at the same time, hopefully, and go into the real world and be prepared and be successful. So we want to get out of school in a position to do that, which will be at grade level or better. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, good, very good points. And some of this we will touch on. We just got two more slides. Christine, go ahead. I see you have your hand up, and then I'll quickly wrap this up and open it fully up. Yep.
I can wait till the end. I apologize. I can wait till
Oh,
the end.
no apologies needed, but I'll be brisk, and then maybe we'll just open this really wide. And some of this gets to Mr. Morse, some of the points that you were bringing to us. I don't think there's a single gold standard for producing measures of academic growth. There's just no basis to say, Texas is doing it right and Mississippi is doing it wrong, or anything like that. That it really gets to what others were saying, that it's about values, and it's about what questions you want to answer, and what's how it's intended to be applied. Some of these we've lingered on. How are the results going to be used? What do we want to answer? What are the policy priorities? What are the conditions and constraints? And I think this is my last slide here. Beyond selecting the model, and I think this is something that you started to allude to as well, Mr. Morris, and I agree, there's very important considerations about implementing it and incorporating accountability. I think this is often one of the most overlooked aspects of growth. I think we tend to get to the place where we say, let's compare and contrast models. And I would just want to bring to the table, there's actually a ton of variability within a particular class of models, depending on how you specify it, depending on what assessments you're using, how you're defining good enough growth, how you're aggregating it, how you're weighting it. And I think you mentioned that in particular in the overall system. What are the business rules? Things like what accounts for a full academic year, or how are you dealing with missing data? All of the collection of all these decisions makes a massive difference. I've seen, states that use value tables can specify them in ways that they mimic growth percentiles or VAMs, and you can specify it in another way, and it looks very different. So there's a lot of degrees of freedom even within models that that influence how they play out. And I'll just, for your reference, there are a few documents for additional reading if it's of interest to any of the participants or observers to this process. And thank you, Christine. You've been patient. I would love to hear from you now.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry, it took me a second to find the unmute button. I would say that as an educator, educators do greatly appreciate wanting to uncover spaces and places where there is significant growth, especially, and I think that the diagrams showing the CREMs, with the tails for the lower performing students, sometimes incredible growth can take place that simply doesn't reach the threshold to be captured in our current systems. So we certainly appreciate the idea that sometimes great things are happening and progress is being made that doesn't meet the level of proficiency required to be visible in the system. That being said, I do think that there are states that provide some good examples and options for ways to really communicate how schools are doing, and to a certain extent kind of separate that from the public's understanding and scoring of schools versus the requirements under ESSA. So ESSA and ESEA requires annual meaningful differentiation of schools and specific categorizations that might be based on information that is not quite the same as what is useful for school improvement, which is a separate process under law, or for driving instruction. And I think Christy mentioned Mississippi earlier, but I think that their dashboard system, the way that they communicate and express how schools are doing by showing the growth that takes place, there are a lot of states that are developing additional ways to kind of create a full color picture of schools in their report cards. And no amount of it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to expand upon our reliance of growth as a single indicator within the accountability system. It means that we're more clear to the public about what the implications of the performance and what the growth means. And Utah, I think Christy also mentioned, is another great example. They use their profile of a graduate to talk more and more about the accomplishments of students rather than defaulting to the same exact indicator that is in the system. And I know I mentioned this before, but different kinds of growth measures may be useful to different purposes. So even if the value, having a value added measure may be really helpful for school improvement planning and analyzing school improvement and establishing a set of decision rules around even exit criteria, putting more pressure on that growth indicator within the system for how you identify schools that need the most help might not actually assist us in identifying places where additional funding and resources can be the most effective at supporting students in schools.
Really helpful comments. Thank you very much. I'd love to just open it up broadly to members of the panel, the board. I'd love to take from this meeting some advice about whether there are particular models that you suggest exploring further. Maybe there were some I didn't list that you think we should add. And then what kind of information will help us to come back and really talk through more thoroughly the benefits and the limitations of various approaches. And I'm okay if you say all the models that we talked about or that we showed merit scrutiny because they're being used. And that's a fair answer. And if so, I would just ask any of our participants if you have some advice about the kinds of information that'd be most helpful to you in helping stimulate your guidance.
Well, I guess I've been kind of marinating on kind of the schools that were given or the states that were given as examples of where we have seen growth as a result of the accountability system. And so I believe they were Mississippi and Utah and Florida. But I was struck by I don't know a lot about Utah and Florida, but I do know a lot about what was going on in Mississippi. And I guess I question where the accountability system actually functioned in what has happened in Mississippi, right? I mean, Mississippi developed the science of reading because they had a billionaire alumni from the University of Mississippi who gave them $100 million 20 or 30 years ago to study literacy. And and that's really good. And I'm glad that they did it. And I'm glad that Mississippi has adopted this model that now all of us are building on. But I'm not sure that that was driven by their accountability system. And so I'd have to go back and look to see kind of what was going on in Florida and where their growth occurred. But I'm also, I guess I'm really struggling with what we're, because I want our accountability system to be transparent and reflective and to allow parents to know how well their school is doing, how well their child is doing inside that school. And but I'm also cognizant to what was that Christine was saying about as an educator, does everything in our accountability system is everything I don't think it can be geared towards and driving instruction and giving teachers what they need to be able to figure out how well their children are doing, right? Like, so I think, for instance, what we're doing with our new literacy screener and that we have picked one that is not only supposed to give a score, but also to identify areas in which a child needs to improve so that a teacher can target in on those areas. And so I guess I don't see how an accountability system does that. Does that make sense? Like and then I'm also really cognizant of how accountability systems are used in the political landscape, right? In the push to expand school choice. And so when I think about moving to an accountability system that did not recognize the student characteristics that are inside a traditional public school in the state of Louisiana, and you have advocates that are pushing various reform packages, and but only traditional public schools will be judged using an accountability system that does not take into account the fact that they are educating the hardest to serve students, then it is very easy to push political agendas around reform and scholarship programs or voucher programs, and to assume that they are successful without putting into place any of the same metrics for those schools. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you put a lot on the table, and I appreciate that. And I think what I'm hearing very clearly in your comments is the importance of really focusing on the different use cases and how growth really matters in very distinct ways across those use cases. So growth in the context of accountability might inspire certain factors as opposed to the growth in the hands of another user for another purpose is sort of, I think, some of the big ideas I hear coming from your comments. Obviously, it's really hard to disentangle to what extent growth or accountability is itself a treatment, meaning that, if I replace a growth model in one state with another, am I going to see different outcomes? If I replace an accountability system in one state with another, and we're going to see different outcomes, as opposed to how it's intertwined with all the important actions that are so vital to teaching and learning, that it's really hard to to know how much of that's inextricably linked with the accountability system specifications itself.
Chris, I guess one question that I would ask, or I agree that it's hard to really figure out whether the accountability system caused the thing, but there is some research. Well, there's a lot of research on like human behavior, right? And I'm curious about incentives, and that which gets measured gets done is an adage that I hear regularly. Right. So like there is a question or a value around like, should the accountability system or should the growth measure for accountability incent behavior, or should it just measure behavior? And I do wonder about that, because I did hear Christy talking about that a little bit when she talked about the 25 points for students that are performing deeply below average. So one value to maybe think about is, should the growth measure for accountability be incentive based, or should it just be a weight, a scale?
No, great comment. Great comment.
So-
Another one I had raised initially when we first started this conversation, one of my initial concerns, as I understood the process, was that there was a question about whether the process that's in place today actually recognizes growth for students that are a year behind or 2 years behind or more. And maybe that's more a function of the test itself than the model. I don't know, but that seems to be an issue. It seems to be a concern. And that's why I was really interested in the diagram, the frequency diagram, was to get a better grasp of that. But given that growth isn't measured equally for every student, I don't really put a lot of stock in that scatter graph. But I am concerned about the current approach to assessing growth for students who aren't at grade level. And how do you do that so that you do recognize, give credit for, incentivize more growth in that space, particularly when a significant amount of your student population is in that space?
Looks like Christy has her hand up.
So just a couple reactions to the current comments. With regard to Mississippi and Florida, both of these states led with a strong system of accountability and then brought the policy changes to bear. So Florida implemented their school accountability system in the late 90s. Just read Florida followed that because they saw the results and said, we need to do something about reading, and we need to do it fast. Same thing with Mississippi. They implemented school accountability first, saw the need, and implemented reading initiatives 4 or 5 years later. And the other thing about Mississippi is they haven't done anything on the math side of it with respect to school improvement or policy changes. They saw even bigger improvements in math over the same time period than they did in reading. That can be probably partially attributed to the accountability systems, because having data changes behavior. If you know and understand what's wrong, you can do something different to change it. And then just when we're talking about characteristics and accountability systems and what the purpose is of them, I always see accountability systems as serving students. The whole reason we started testing was at the federal level, why states had to start testing and we had federal accountability, is to drive more funding and resources via Title I into schools to make sure students that were the lowest performing were helping. It breaks my heart to see states have lower expectations for students that are currently lower performing to make a school look better than what it might be. And these are tough love options, but if students don't get what they need from their K-12 system, when they walk out into a job interview or to a university and say, but I made growth every year, no one's going to care if they can't read or do math that meet expectations for that job or that college. So I'm always looking at this from the student perspective is we need to make sure that we are incentivizing outcomes that are meaningful to students. Because if we're not, why are we holding, or what are we holding schools accountable for? I mean, if kids aren't prepared to go out and get jobs and go to college, we're in a whole lot more trouble trying to solve it after they leave K-12 than we do when they're in K-12. So I hope we don't go down the path of having lower expectations for traditionally underserved students. And I do hope we take Christine's suggestions of bringing it all back, looking at the data. The system itself can't tell you what to do, but the system can tell you where the biggest deficiencies are in student learning and be able to help remedy those through state policy action.
I agree with everything that I just heard, Christy. I agree 100% with everything I just heard from you. But I'm still, it's not clear in my mind how you give appropriate credit, because I think we obviously need to give appropriate credit where credit is due, whether it's moving a kid from basic to mastery or unsat to basic. It's progress. And my understanding is the current system doesn't do that very well on the bottom side of that scale. So that's my concern is if that growth is not recognized appropriately, then how do you incentivize people to go work in that environment if they're not getting credit for the work that's done? That's probably my biggest concern.
And I
Dr. Davis?
No, I mean, I understand where Christy is coming from and the idea of serving students, but I also am putting that first, but I do understand, right, to your point about, teacher vacancies, right? And the number of we can't get educators to enter this profession. They are leaving it. And when we do exit, interviews, right, the research is showing that a lot of this is around kind of how they are perceived in their job as failures, right? Under accountability systems, the paperwork. And I mean, we could get on into it, but I think that to your point, right, that we have to figure out a way to do what Christy is asking us to do, which is to put serving students first, but at the same time, recognizing that our accountability system does not exist in a vacuum, and that how we design it affects teachers and their decisions to stay in their jobs, to choose which schools they're going to serve in. And so I think that trying to figure out how we do both of those things is really important.
Christine?
I would just offer two considerations for, I guess you could call it decision rules that are
Good.
not necessarily, we rely on growth indicators as part of a system to tell us where assistance or resources are needed the most, and then maybe identify whether or not interventions that are applied improve outcomes. To the extent that they can inform them, I think is a different matter for debate. But ESSA does offer two options that might interest the board. The first would be there are additional designations that states can identify in order to award recognition to schools and or districts that are performing well on a particular measure or number of measures. And that is a low risk, sort of hold harmless option. if you are expanding your ability to measure and capture growth at a school, it doesn't necessarily have to go into the accountability system and for TSI, CSI, ATSI. States have the liberty under their state plans to create additional designations, and some of them do. Some of them recognize gap closure, for example, that's speedier than average. They recognize extremely high performing schools, for example. So I think that that's one option. The other option might be, part of the reason that there is the fear around not having excellence recognized, whether it's in growth or in other well-rounded indicators of student success that may or may not be academic or may not fall under ELA and math, would be to, I think that the reason the fear is there is because once a school is put on a list for CSI or for, I think it's UIR, right? There are consequences associated with that label that don't necessarily feel a whole lot like support. And if a school were to demonstrate a significant level of growth, for example, you could write it into your plan that they would qualify for continued support, but not be subject to additional rigorous or punitive interventions, creating a category wherein you're awarding that growth and providing an incentive to demonstrate it, but not necessarily subjecting the school to a continuous pipeline wherein they're losing jurisdiction and the power to kind of apply their own interventions. So you do have options. Perfecting the growth indicator in and of itself is important, but the application is very much, the consequences that stem from them is important as well.
This is super rich and helpful, and I'm grateful to everybody. I'm also cognizant of the time and our need to open it up for public comment. If it's agreeable, let me just spend 2 minutes saying kind of what I'm expecting from here, and then let's honor our obligation for public comment if it's okay with the chair. I think what we'll do here at the center is we'll certainly write up the notes from this meeting, and I'd like to, because we only have 2 more meetings scheduled. I'd like to put together a draft outline of the areas in which we're going to provide feedback and start to populate it with the things we're already hearing. I'd also like to go ahead and bring, and I think it'll help us get momentum if we bring some deeper information about the models, some illustrations of how they're being implemented, seed it with what feedback we've gotten from the literature, and give the panel an opportunity to weigh in on that. The panel's voice is what this is all about. So what I want to do is give the panel a little momentum. But that's kind of what I'm seeing for the next meeting. And I want to pause a moment to see if folks think that sort of the vision for where we're going sounds agreeable.
Chris, I think that we need to, in the next meeting, bring a set of value statements that we can then tie to growth models so that folks can really, I've heard folks sit in tension in this meeting over growth, getting to mastery, improving, these things are all going to kind of sit in tension with each other. And I think most folks on the board are going to have some degree of spectrum of where they sit on it. And they're going to need a set of values to really help them identify the best type of growth measure to satisfy all of their wants and desires. So values is something that we need to spend some time on.
I've got another one too. I think Christy alluded to this. And if I go back to that scatter graph on slide 14, it seems reasonable to me to assume that if I have different goals, I'm going to have different outcomes. And so I'm curious if there's a way to provide a trajectory for two different, or I guess two different trajectories. One, I guess one without a VAM and one with a VAM, right? If I've got goals that are lower because my peer group has lower performance than the rest of the population. What does that outcome look like over time, as opposed to everybody's got the same expectations, and so the bar is at one place for everybody. You're still going to have different outcomes, but I'm interested in what the trajectory differences might look like. Does that make sense?
I think I hear you suggesting maybe take the covariates out of the model and see what results you get.
Right. That's exactly right. And then compare the two.
Mhm.
Any thoughts on that?
Are you talking about just looking at the expected score without the adjustment for the student characteristics? Okay. I think that we could do that between now and then. If you start removing and selecting covariates, then you've got to rerun the model, and that takes weeks and weeks and weeks, which we don't have.
Particularly if we could just find just an illustrative scope. Every content area for multiple years would be super hard, but if we could just do it in at least one instantiation.
I mean, bottom line, I think what we're all interested in is outcomes,
Yeah.
right? It's just a matter of how do you get there? How do we incentivize it? How do we measure it?
So are you suggesting take them out?
He's
Because since that's how we evaluate teachers,
he's suggesting looking at different options and how those things, how they play out differently when you remove the student characteristics. But he's not talking about wholesale policy change around everything with growth. He's just,
Right.
This is explorative,
Right.
exploratory.
Right.
That's the word.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Lambert. Just so we have a better understanding of what's going on.
Very helpful. Thank you all.
Anything else before we go to public comment?
Not for me, sir.
Not hearing anything. I see we do have some public comment. All right, we've got Dr. Angela Beck. She's representing herself, information only, and she wishes to speak. Dr. Beck, if you would identify yourself for the record. And
I am Angela Beck. Come to a number of these meetings, and I'm so grateful that you are taking the time to do this. Today was like a very powerful meeting. I thought the data that the company and you guys went over was amazing. I do want to point out a couple of things. One is we've been talking about growth, which is definitely needs to, I think, incentivize or celebrate students who are moving in the right direction. I just want to remind you that where the schools are held accountable for lower performance is in that academic index. There is a place already where schools are, getting, if you're unsatisfactory or approaching, you're getting a 0 times 2 for English and for math. So the growth index does need to bring something else to the table, because that piece or that mechanism is where the schools are held responsible for a low performance, if that makes sense.
Forward, just make sure I'm clear on that one. I think what I'm hearing, your points are really more towards the SPS calculation than the growth assessment itself. Is that accurate?
What I'm trying to say, I know there's a lot of discussion around and which needs to be solved. What do we do for the kids who are not on grade level and go up to a test that is on grade level, right? How do we measure this growth? And what do we do about, and that needs to be solved. And that's what I'm saying, that growth index should be used to help to solve that problem, because we're held accountable for that. Okay, that kid's not on grade level, they're probably going to score an unsatisfactory. Let's be real. they're held accountable there in that academic index times 2. And we already remember, even if they shift up a little bit in that unsatisfactory and they're outpacing their peers, right? That overall score is only a 37.5 that school gets. That is a low F, right? And so that brings me to my next point, which I love this table for slides 10 and 11, because if you look at a child who is, behind the starting line, as we say, right? And we're working very hard K through 2, trying to get them sped up. They're not quite there yet. They score that unsatisfactory. Basically, 75% of those kids by 8th grade or their 8th grade score, 75% of that total 3rd grade that started out in unsatisfactory will fall between unsatisfactory and approaching basic. Only 5% of the kids who started out scoring unsatisfactory in 3rd grade will make it to the mastery and advance according to our data. I'm not saying it's impossible. And that's what we want to work on to move those numbers better, right? I think the tests need to be a little bit more sensitive to, again, measuring the growth of like students who aren't, to encourage the teachers, to encourage the students. There are different ways to do that. I would actually, I've taken the sample tests myself as a leader to see what our kids are up against. I definitely encourage you to go online and do the same. You will see if it's a 3rd grader that if they're not on, on grade level, it's a difficult test for them. It's a lot of A, B choice. If you don't get part A right, you can't get part B right, because that's the evidence piece, right? So you miss gobs of these questions on the test, and then you have writing sections. And if you're struggling, you can see, and that's how the test design for 3rd grade through 8th grade is for our kids. So it makes sense that if you're struggling then, and you haven't caught up on those skills to master a test of that level, you still won't do well in 8th grade. So it makes sense to me why this data remains this way. The other piece that I want to say is, if you're, let's just hypothetically say a turnaround 6th through 8th, right? You have kids that are coming in with large gaps. According to our data, it make it very difficult for a school as such to get to a passing score of a C, right? And just remind you also, panel, the C this year moves up from a 60 to a 65. Next year it moves from a 65 to a 70. So I'm putting that out there because there are charter schools on the line that serve large populations of kids who have gaps and are working very hard and diligently. But as you can see, it's like flip a coin, 4 times, 3 out of times you're going to get heads, right? According to our data. Also, last point I want to make is that we are only one of 2 states that test our kids in every subject, every grade level. And I think when we start talking about apples to apples and why are other states performing well and what's happening there, and I'm not saying science and social studies are not important. That is not what I'm saying. I think the future is science and things, but at the same time, if we're going to go up against a Mississippi who follows ESSA to the T, and they only test science once in, the 3 through 5 and once in that, 6 through 8, right? And they don't actually do social studies, to my understanding, unless something changed recently. I think if we're going to take on a model of a state, then we need to take on the model of what they're actually doing too. So then we can measure, how do we truly compare? Because I feel like oftentimes we're comparing apples and oranges and trying to make some kind of connection to things to make it make sense for us. And it's not, I don't feel like apple orange comparison puts us up truly against how our state will perform if we're making a change, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to put all that. I know that's so much, but I apologize.
Well, we appreciate you coming out today and thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
All right, members, any other comments? All right, hearing none, can I get a motion to adjourn?
Back to this, the minutes. We need to go back to the minutes. We didn't approve them, but now we don't have a quorum. So, Okay, we'll do that next time.
All right. All right. Hearing no exception, I believe we're adjourned. Thanks so much to our panel. Appreciate your time again, guys, the expertise that you bring to this exercise. Looking forward to our next meeting. So thank you again.
Thank you all.